The Vailindra had been drifting for 6 days. Not because her engines had failed. This was not because her navigation core had collapsed into a recursive loop of bad calculations. Not because Commander Sera Okafor had made a mistake in the jump coordinates. She had not. She was, by every measurement her crew trusted, the most precise navigator in the unified Earth fleet. She could plot a gravitational slingshot through a binary system using nothing but a pencil, a coffee-stained star chart, and the particular silence that lived behind her eyes when she was thinking hard. No. The Vailindra drifted because Sera had ordered her to drift. "Keep us slow," she had told her helmsman, Lieutenant Darius Wynne, on the morning of the 3rd day. "Keep us quiet. I want to look before we speak." Darius had looked at her sideways, that long, careful look he always used when he was deciding whether to push back. He was 29 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that was always halfway through a thought. He had been Sera's helmsman for 4 years. He pushed back approximately 40% of the time. The present moment was one of the 60% moments. "Yes, Commander," he had said, and slowed the ship to a crawl. So the Vailindra drifted through the outer edge of the Tessavar system, which was the name Earth's astronomers had given it because the star at its center pulsed in a pattern that, if you translated it into sound waves, produced something very close to the word Tessavar, in an obscure West African dialect meaning, "I am still here." The astronomers had found this amusing. Sera found it unnerving. She had not told anyone that it unnerved her because commanders did not share that kind of thing before a first contact mission. Commanders shared things like fuel capacity, atmospheric readings, and probability matrices. She shared those things. She kept the unnerving feeling in the back of her throat, where it had lived for 6 days, tasting faintly of copper. The Vailindra was not a small ship. She was 460 meters long, built on the Mars orbital platform over 11 years, fitted with enough processing power to run simultaneous simulations of every known stellar phenomenon, and crewed by 212 people whose combined expertise covered 47 disciplines. She carried 3 short-range diplomatic shuttles, a full medical bay, a garden deck where actual soil had been transported from 6 different continents, and a single long-range weapon system that no one aboard had ever fired in an active engagement. Earth called her a Titan-class vessel. The designation was not about size, though she was enormous. It was about purpose. Titans were the ships Earth sent when it wanted to say something it could not say with words, when it wanted its presence to function as a sentence. "We are here. We are serious. We have prepared." The weapons system was not intended for use. It was intended to be known about. There was a philosophy behind the Titan classification that Sera had spent a great deal of her career agreeing with and a growing portion of her nights quietly questioning. She was 38 years old. She had dark eyes and close-cropped natural hair and a habit of pressing her thumb against the inside of her left wrist when she was working through a problem. Not a nervous habit but a focusing one, the way some people tapped a rhythm or stared at a fixed point. She had been chosen for this mission by a committee of 17 people who had reviewed her record for 6 months, and their conclusion had been, essentially, that Sera Okafor was the person you sent when the situation had no precedent. This situation had no precedent. Because 6 weeks ago, the Vailindra's long-range array had detected something in the Tessavar system that had no business being there. A structure. Not a natural formation, not a crystalline asteroid or a magnetized gas formation shaped by unusual solar winds. A structure. Geometric. Deliberate. Built. 47 kilometers wide. The committee had convened within 8 hours. Sera had been on leave in Nairobi. She had received the call while sitting in her mother's garden, drinking tea that was too hot, watching a weaver bird construct its nest with methodical, unhurried precision. She had finished her tea before answering. "I'll need 6 months to prepare," she had told them. They had given her 3. She had used every hour. Now, on the 6th day of drifting, she stood at the forward observation deck, a curved transparency of 3-centimeter glass that spanned the entire nose of the ship, and looked at what was there. The structure was closer now. Close enough to see without magnification, which meant it was close enough to feel, and feeling it was a different experience than analyzing it from 6 weeks' worth of sensor data. The data provided her with dimensions, geometric angles, and surface composition, a silicate metallite compound that Earth's mineralogists did not yet have a proper name for. The data had told her it was probably inhabited, based on low-level electromagnetic readings that suggested active internal systems. The data had not told her that it would look, in certain angles of the system's pale amber light, almost organic. It resembled something that had grown rather than been assembled. Like the inside of a vast and patient mind that had decided to make itself visible. Behind her she heard footsteps. Dr. Vance, she said without turning. How do you always know? Said Dr. Elise Vance, the mission's chief xenolinguist, as she came to stand beside her. Elise was 44, thin, with reading glasses perpetually pushed up into silver-streaked hair and the particular expression of someone who had spent 30 years studying languages that did not yet exist and was now, finally, standing in front of one. You walk like you're about to ask a question, Sera said. I am always about to ask a question. I know. They stood together in silence for a moment, looking at the structure. It's extraordinary, Elise said softly. Yes. Are you scared? Sera pressed her thumb against the inside of her left wrist. I'm focused, she said. Elise looked at her sideways. Those aren't mutually exclusive. No, Sera agreed. They're not. She turned from the window. Tell Darius to stop the drift. We hold position here. She paused. And tell Dr. Reyes I want a full atmospheric analysis of the surrounding space within 2,000 kilometers of that structure. Everything. Particulate density, radiation spectrum, the works. He ran that analysis 3 days ago. I know. I want him to run it again. Elise nodded, recognizing the tone. Not paranoia. Preparation. She left. Sera turned back to the window. I am still here, the star pulsed. Sera watched the structure breathe in amber light and wondered if it was watching back. The protocol was called Threshold. Earth had developed it over 40 years, revised it 11 times, argued about it in 6 different international bodies, translated it into every known human language, and delivered the final version in a document 420 pages long. Sera had read it twice cover to cover and could recite most of it from memory. The core of Threshold was simple: do not assume. Do not assume the other species communicates through sound. Do not assume they use light for vision. Do not assume they have individual identities in the way humans understand individuality. Do not assume that silence means absence, that stillness means death, that proximity means aggression, or that any gesture that resembles a human gesture carries the same human meaning. Do not assume. It sounded simple. It was, in practice, one of the most cognitively demanding instructions a human being could follow, because the human brain was an assumption machine. It ran on pattern recognition. It took incoming data and instantly, automatically, before conscious thought could intervene, sorted it into known categories. This was what kept humans alive. It was also what made first contact extraordinarily dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with weapons. Sera thought about this often. She was thinking about it now, in the mission briefing room, looking at her core team assembled around a table that had been bolted to the floor of the Valindra's middeck since the ship was built. The table was plain alloy, functional, and slightly scratched. Sera liked it. It was unpretentious in a situation that had every opportunity to become pretentious. Present, Darius Wynne, helmsman. Dr. Elise Vance, xenolinguistics. Dr. Marco Reyes specializes in atmospheric and environmental science. Lieutenant Commander Nadia Cho is responsible for security and tactical operations. Dr. James Osei specializes in xenobiology and first contact medicine. And Lieutenant Felix Torres communicates. 6 people. Sera made 7. What do we know? She said. Not a question. An opening. Marco Reyes spoke first because he always spoke first when there was data, and there was always data. He was 35, compact, with the slightly distracted energy of someone whose mind ran slightly faster than his surroundings. The second atmospheric analysis confirms the first, he said, pulling up a holographic display above the table. The space around the structure, within approximately 1,800 kilometers, shows something I'm calling an environmental gradient. Basically, the composition of the surrounding space changes the closer you get to the structure. Not dramatically, but measurably. Changes how? Nadia asked. She was 41 and precise, with close-cropped hair and the habit of asking the most direct version of every question. Pressure increases slightly. Particulate density goes up. There's a faint but consistent electromagnetic field that gets stronger closer in. Marco paused. And the radiation spectrum, specifically in the low ultraviolet range, shows regular rhythmic fluctuation. Every 43 seconds like clockwork. Silence. That's a signal, Felix said. He was 26, the youngest in the room, with the kind of careful enthusiasm that hadn't yet decided whether to become confidence or anxiety. That's a deliberate signal. It could be a signal, Elise corrected gently. It could also be a byproduct of their power systems. Or a biological emission from something inside the structure. We shouldn't assign intent before we understand mechanism. Felix nodded, absorbing this. What would it mean if it's a signal? Sera asked. Elise thought. It's rhythmic, not complex. If it's intentional communication, it could be a beacon, a "we are here," a baseline. This is an invitation to respond in kind or to use it as a reference frequency for further communication attempts. Or a warning, Nadia said. Or a warning, Elise agreed without discomfort. James, Sera said. Xenobiology. Dr. James Osei was 61, the oldest person in the room, with silver locks and a voice that seemed to carry more gravity than the ship's own systems. He had spent his career preparing for a moment that hadn't existed yet. Sera respected him in a way that was different from how she respected anyone else on the crew, not for rank or expertise alone, but for the kind of patience that could only be built by wanting something for a very long time without losing the want. The structure's surface shows variation that's consistent with either architectural design or biological growth, he said. Possibly both. Some civilizations don't draw a meaningful line between those two things. The internal electromagnetic readings suggest active systems, powered, maintained, and operational. Something inside that structure is running. Whether it's automated or actively inhabited, I can't say yet. He paused. But the gradient Marco described, the way the environment changes around the structure, that's interesting. That suggests the structure isn't just sitting in space. It's interacting with its environment, modifying it. Why would they modify the space around their structure? Darius asked. Could be environmental regulation, James said. Could be defense. It could be communication. It could be something we don't have a word for yet. He smiled slightly. That's the honest answer. Sera looked around the table. Felix, can you respond to the UV signal without transmitting anything that would give them a detailed map of our systems or capabilities? Felix thought carefully. She appreciated that he thought before he spoke. If I match the frequency and pattern exactly but keep it minimal, just a reflection essentially, then yes. They'd know we received it. They wouldn't learn much about how we received it. Do that, Sera said. Once. Gently. And then we wait. How long do we wait? Darius asked. Sera looked at the holographic display, the amber star pulsing in the distance, the structure geometric and vast and patient in the foreground. Until they answer, she said. They answered in 11 hours. Not with a UV pulse. Not with a matched frequency. Not with any form of electromagnetic communication at all. They answered by opening a door. Not a metaphorical door. An actual door, a section of the structure's exterior surface, roughly circular, 300 meters in diameter, which simply parted. No visible mechanism. There is no hinge, track, or pressure seal. The material of the structure's surface moved the way water moves when you put your hand into it, and when the door was fully open, what lay beyond it was visible from the Vailindra sensors as a space. A chamber internally lit by a light source that produced no electromagnetic radiation in any spectrum the ship's instruments could directly detect. That's not possible, Marco said from the science station. His voice was serene in the way that voices go very calm when the person speaking is experiencing something their framework cannot accommodate. Clearly it is, Nadia said. Nadia, Sera said. Commander. What's your threat assessment? Nadia studied her screens for 15 seconds. Sera counted. No weapon signatures I recognize. No targeting systems. No trajectory changes from the structure itself. She paused. The door opening doesn't read as hostile. It reads as... She searched for a word. Deliberate. Considered. An invitation, Elise said softly. Or a test, James said. Or both, Sera said. She looked at the open door for a long time. 300 meters wide. The light was beyond the reach of instruments. A chamber beyond. They received our pulse, she said. They identified it as intentional. They responded not with a matching signal but with a physical action. An opening. They're not trying to communicate in our language. They're trying to create a space for communication. That's a sophisticated distinction, Elise said, and there was something in her voice that sounded like wonder. Yes, Sera said. It is. She turned to Darius. Take us in. 1/10 impulse. And tell the whole ship. Nobody panics. Whatever they see, whatever the sensors do, nobody panics. What if the sensors go blind? Marco asked. Then we use our eyes, Sera said. We have those too. Darius brought the Vailindra forward. The structure grew in the forward windows until it filled the entire forward view, and then the door filled it, and then the door was around them, and then they were inside. The sensors went blind. Not all at once. Gradually, the way sight fails when you move from bright sunlight into a dark room. First the long-range arrays went dark, then the mid-range, then the immediate environmental sensors flickered and dropped to 20% capacity, then 10, then they settled at a faint, uncertain hum that told Marco they were still technically functioning but providing readings he described as impressionistic. Impressionistic, Darius repeated. They're picking up something, Marco said. But I can't tell you what. The chamber around them was visible through the windows. It was vast, large enough to contain the Vailindra with space to spare in every direction. The walls curved upward and inward in a way that felt less like architecture and more like being inside a held breath. The light, that impossible light that no instrument could read, was everywhere and came from nowhere, a soft, sourceless illumination that made everything visible but cast no shadows. And standing, if standing was the right word and it was the closest available word, at the far end of the chamber were three figures. The crew saw them before the sensors did, because the sensors weren't working and the crew's eyes were. Silence fell across the bridge like weather. HFY, Felix breathed. It escaped him like a reflex, like something that runs deeper than protocol, the ancient human instinct to mark a moment that will never come again. Nobody corrected him. Nobody said anything at all for 33 seconds, which was how long it took the three figures to cross the chamber to within 50 meters of the Vailindra's forward window. They were tall, perhaps 3 meters at their full extension, though extension was the better word because their bodies didn't maintain a single fixed height. They moved in a way that suggested their skeletal structure, if they had one, was not rigid. They flowed. They occupied space differently than humans did, not displacing it but integrating with it so that the air around them seemed to move as part of them rather than around them. They had 4 upper limbs that functioned differently from arms. 2 were clearly manipulative, ending in structures that might be hands, and 2 were extended outward in a way that suggested sensory function, their tips trembling faintly like antennae. Their coloring shifted, not like a cephalopod's camouflage but like thought made visible, slow color changes that moved through their skin in waves. Amber, deep violet, and something close to green but not quite. Their faces, the region of their heads that faced the Vailindra's window, had no mouth. No visible mouth. There were eyes, bilateral, large, with irises that were not round but elongated vertically and the color of deep water, and which blinked in a lateral motion rather than vertical. The three figures looked at the ship. The ship looked at the three figures. James Osei stood at the forward window, and his face held the expression of a man who had spent 61 years preparing for this exact moment and was now discovering that preparation and arrival are 2 entirely different experiences. "Commander," he said quietly. "They're breathing." "I see that," Sera said. She had noticed the faint rhythmic movement of their forms, not chest expansion, nothing so simple, but a pulsing undulation that moved through their entire bodies in sequence, like a wave. "The chamber must be pressurized to support them," James continued. "Which means they adapted this space to make it survivable for beings who breathe in the conventional sense." He paused. "They knew we were coming. Not just that something was coming. That we were coming. With our biology." The weight of that settled over the bridge. "They've been watching us," Nadia said. "Not alarmed. Observation. Or they're better scientists than us," Sera said. One of the three figures raised a manipulative limb. Slowly. The quality of deliberateness was so human in its care that it produced a sudden and unexpected sense of vertigo in several crew members, the dizziness of recognition across an unbridgeable distance. It held its limb raised, palm, if that was a palm, facing the ship. "Caro," Elise said in a voice so quiet it was almost a breath. "Wait. Hold. I see you." She looked at Sera. "That's a greeting," she said. "In almost every human culture, a raised open hand is a non-aggressive acknowledgement. If they've studied us, and they have, they chose that gesture intentionally. They're using our language to say hello." Sera stepped forward until she was standing at the very front of the bridge, directly in front of the forward window, where the figure could see her clearly. She raised her hand. The first 3 days inside the chamber were conducted in silence. Not awkward silence, not the silence of 2 parties who had run out of things to say, but working silence, the silence of mutual, intense attention. The 3 figures, who Elise had taken to calling the Veil, borrowing the name from the system, because she needed something to call them that wasn't the aliens, remained in the chamber when the Vailindra's crew emerged in environmental suits, and the process that followed was something that Elise would later describe as the most demanding intellectual work of her life. They began with observation. The Veil communicated among themselves through color. The waves of amber and violet and green that moved across their skin were not random. They were patterned. Grammatical. Elise sat cross-legged on the chamber floor with 3 recording devices and watched those patterns for 16 hours without stopping, mapping sequences, noting what appeared to produce responses, and identifying what seemed to be individual voices, even within a non-auditory system. The figures had different color signatures. The tallest one, the one that had raised its hand first, carried a dominant thread of deep violet in its patterns. The set-hatted, shorter and with a different arrangement of sensory limbs, moved in amber and gold. The third was quieter in its patterns and less frequent, which Elise initially interpreted as a lower communication role and later revised. It was listening more than speaking. "They're having a conversation about us," she told Sera on the morning of the second day. They were sitting at the edge of the Valindra's landing ramp, in suits, looking across the chamber to where the 3 veils stood in a loose cluster. "What are they saying?" Sera asked. "I don't know yet. But the structure of it, the way one speaks and the others receive, the way a response builds gradually rather than comes all at once, that's not so different from us. There's turn-taking. There's acknowledgement." She paused. "They're not so alien that they don't have conversation." "No," Sera said. "Just alien enough that their conversation looks like weather." Elise smiled at that. On the afternoon of the second day, the violet veil approached Elise directly, moved to within 4 meters of her, which was a distance that made Felix, watching from 20 meters back, quietly put his hand on his sidearm. Sera saw this and shook her head slightly at him, and he removed his hand. The violet veil produced a sequence of color patterns. Slow, repeated 3 times with small variations. Elise watched. She did not respond immediately. She watched the sequence a 4th time in her recording device, paused it and watched it again. "It's showing me something," she said. "The same sequence is repeated 3 times with minor changes each time. Like it's conjugating. Like it's showing me that the pattern can change and the change carries meaning." She looked up. "It's teaching me. HFY," she said, half to herself, half to the universe, the phrase arriving from somewhere older than training or protocol, from the place inside every human being that knows when a door has opened that was never opened before. She looked at the veil. She produced the sequence back, imperfectly with her hands, using the color panels Felix had rigged in her suit, which could produce approximately 40 of the colors in the veil's spectrum. The violet veil went still for a long moment. Then it produced the sequence again, this time with a new element at the end, 1 additional color, 1 additional movement. Elise repeated the original sequence and added the new element. The chamber flooded briefly with gold from all 3 veils simultaneously, a wave of color that moved through all of them at once and then subsided. "What was that?" Darius asked from the ship. "Applause," Elise said. "I think that was applause." The teaching began in earnest after that. Over the following 36 hours, the violet veil, who Elise had begun calling Vi in her notes, with a private acknowledgement that naming was a human habit she couldn't break and probably shouldn't try, worked with Elise in a systematic deconstruction and reconstruction of communication. Not teaching language directly but teaching the structure of meaning, showing how concepts could be expressed, how combinations carried compound meaning, and how the same element in a different position in a sequence produced a different idea. It was not translation. It was something prior to translation. It was 2 minds building a bridge from the ground up, finding the stones that existed in both territories. By the end of the 3rd day, Elise had approximately 80 concepts she could express and receive with reasonable confidence. Not words. Concepts. Abstract concepts include here, now, us, you, question, observation, uncertain, certain, time and change. 80 concepts were enough to have a very limited, cautious conversation. She came to Sera that night. They were keeping Earth time inside the ship, because humans needed circadian rhythm even in the absence of a sun, with exhausted eyes and an expression that was equal parts triumph and gravity. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Sit," Sera said. She poured Elise coffee from her personal supply and sat across from her at the small table in her quarters. Elise wrapped her hands around the mug. "Vi, the violet one, asked me a question today. In concepts I understand. And I want to make sure I tell you exactly what was asked before I tell you what I think it means." "Go ahead." The question was, "Are you the first of your kind or are there others like you who came before you?" Sera was quiet. "They're asking whether we sent diplomats first or warriors first," Elise said. "They want to know the order. Whether contact comes before force in our civilization, or whether such an arrangement is unusual." Sera held the conversation for a long moment. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing yet. I told Vi I needed to consider before answering, which is a concept we established this afternoon." Vi accepted that. Elise looked at her. But, Sera, the fact that they're asking means they have a history. It means something came to them before that did not speak first. Someone else has found them, Sera said. Someone else has found them, Elise confirmed. And what happened wasn't this. The next morning, Sera did something she had never done in 4 years of diplomatic missions. She left her rank at the door. Not literally. She still wore the Valindra's insignia on her suit. But she walked into the chamber alone. No Nadia, no Felix, no James at a careful distance. And she sat down on the floor of the chamber, which was smooth and faintly warm and composed of the same silicate metallite compound as the outer structure. She waited. The 3 Veil were already there. They were always there. Sera had begun to wonder whether they slept, and if so, whether sleep for them looked like what it looked like for a human: absence, shutdown, stillness. Or whether it was something else. Whether they were always slightly awake, the way oceans are always slightly awake. Vi moved toward her. Sera had a portable translation interface. Felix had built it in 2 days, a screen mounted on her forearm that could produce color sequences from a keyboard input, based on the vocabulary Elise had mapped. It was imprecise. It was the best they had. She typed, "I have considered. I will answer your question." Vi received this and responded with an amber gold wave, acknowledgement, readiness, and the color of attention. Sera typed, "We have sent voices before weapons. But we have brought the weapons with us." She let that sit. Then, "This was a choice made by those above me. I believe it was a mistake." A long pause. Vi's color shifted slowly, not the rapid signaling of communication, but something deeper, something that moved through its body like a tide. Sera had no word for what that was. She waited. Vi replied, "Why do you speak against what those above you chose?" Sera thought carefully before responding. She typed, "Because truth before strangers is more important than appearance." Another long pause. Vi turned to the other 2 Veil, a rapid exchange of color, amber and violet, and the quiet green of the third, and then turned back. "We have a word for what you are doing," Vi communicated. "It has no equivalent in any communication we have received from beyond this system." "What is the word?" Sera typed. The color sequence Vi produced was one Elise had not yet catalogued. A new one, complex, built from familiar elements combined in an unfamiliar structure. Sera captured it on her recording device. Later, when she showed it to Elise, the linguist studied it for a long time. "Best I can do," Elise said finally, "is the practice of making oneself small before the truth." She looked up. Not weakness. Not submission. Something more like voluntary transparency. As a form of respect. Sera nodded slowly. "They have a word for it," Elise said. "A single word, which means it's a concept important enough in their culture to be named. And they'd never encountered it from outside their culture before," Sera said. "No," Elise said. "Not until you sat down on their floor and told them you'd brought weapons and thought that was a mistake." The silence between them held a particular quality, the specific weight of something that cannot be undone, for better or worse. "What happened to the ones who came before?" Sera asked. Elise's expression shifted. "I've been working on that. Vi showed me something yesterday, not in language, an image. They can project things, apparently, not holographic, more like an impression, like they can extrude a shared perception into the space between us. I don't have proper words for how it works." She paused. "But Vi showed me a shape. A ship shape. Much smaller than the Vailindra. It came close to the structure and then it opened, not the way we open communication, more like it discharged something. And the structure." She stopped. "And the structure what?" Sera said. "The structure didn't answer the way it answered us," Elise said. "It closed. It sealed itself. Every opening sealed, every signal stopped. It went dark, and it stayed dark for what Vi communicated as a very long time." She met Sera's eyes. "They went dormant. They shut themselves away. For generations, Sera. The Veil went dormant because someone shot at them, and they had no framework for what that meant." Sera sat with that for a long time. "They woke up for us," she said finally. "They woke up for us," Elise confirmed. "And I don't think we fully understand what that cost them." On the 7th day inside the chamber, Marco's sensors started working again. Not all at once. Not at full capacity. But gradually, if something inside the structure had decided to allow them, the way a person decides to allow a stranger to see inside their home. Marco ran diagnostics at 6 in the morning and found 60% capacity restored across the board. "The environmental field is changing," he told Sera. "The gradient is reconfiguring. Whatever produced the sensor blackout, I think they're reducing it, Intentionally? Sera asked. Almost certainly. She went to the chamber. Vi was there. You are allowing our instruments to work, Sera typed. You showed us the weapons without hiding, Vi responded. We allow your instruments without hiding. Reciprocity. Not naive, knowing. An exchange that was also a statement. We understand what you did and we are answering in kind. Sera typed, what will the instruments show us? And Vi showed her, instead of telling, producing that strange impression sharing that Elise had described. It was not visual in the ordinary sense. It was more like a sudden knowledge, as if the information deposited itself directly into Sera's awareness without passing through her eyes. What she received was the inside of the structure. Not its physical interior, though she understood its scale, which was vast. What she received was a sense of what was inside. It was not machinery in any sense that she recognized. Something closer to an ecology. A living system. The structure was not a ship or a station the way the Vailindra was. It was more like a territory. A maintained, inhabited territory. Sustained by processes that were partly technological and partly, she had no better word, grown. And within that territory many Vail. Not 3. Thousands. There are thousands of them in there, she told her team that evening. The bridge was quiet. And they've been dormant, she continued. Most of them, the majority of the population of this structure, have been in some state of reduced activity since the last contact. Since whoever shot at them. She looked around the table. 3 of them woke up when our UV pulse arrived. 3 out of thousands. Why 3? James asked. I think they drew the short straw, Darius said, and then immediately looked as though he regretted the levity. But Sera shook her head. No, that's actually close. I think the 3 who woke up were the ones whose role was to wake first. To assess. He had to decide whether to wake the others. She paused. Vi and the others are deciding right now whether what they're seeing from us warrants bringing their whole civilization back. The weight of that was enormous and everyone in the room felt it. What do they need to see? Nadia asked. I don't know yet, Sera said. But I think it is something they cannot observe from outside of us. Something that has to be demonstrated. She pressed her thumb to her wrist. I think they need to see us disagree with ourselves. Disagree? Felix said. They went dormant because something arrived that was coherent in only one direction. Aggressive. Single-minded. No internal conflict visible. She looked at the table. A civilization that shows no internal conflict looks like a weapon. It looks like it has only one mode. She paused. I want to invite them onto the Vailindra. Nadia went very still. Commander. I know. That is not in the threshold protocol. I know. Bringing an unknown entity of unknown capability and unknown intention aboard. Nadia. Sera's voice was quiet and firm. The threshold protocol was written for a situation that does not apply here. We are beyond the edge of what was anticipated. I need to use judgment. That's what I'm doing, Nadia said. Not hostile. Not backing down. Exactly what Sera had described to the Veil. Internal conflict, visible. Sera looked at her for a moment. You're right to push. I want you to have that objection. I want it documented. And I want you to come with me when Vi boards, because your job isn't to agree with me. It's to protect this crew. Nadia held the eye contact for 3 seconds. Understood, she said. Good, Sera said. That's what I need them to see. Vi came aboard the Vailindra on the 8th day. Alone, the amber gold veil and the quiet green one remained in the chamber. Vi stepped through the Vailindra's airlock and into the inside with the same smooth and careful movements that Sera had seen from the species before. Not cautious exactly, present. Fully and entirely present, the way a very old and experienced traveler is present in a new place, taking nothing for granted and alarmed at nothing. The crew handled it with professional grace, which Sera was proud of. There were eyes following Vi through every corridor, of course there were, but no one crowded, no one reached out, and no one produced a device to photograph. Sera had given a ship-wide address the evening before. Tomorrow we have a guest, she had said. I want every person on this ship to think about what it would mean to be a guest yourself, to arrive somewhere that nothing about you was designed for, where every object and every space was built for a kind of body and a kind of mind that is not yours. Think about what courtesy means in that situation. And then be that courtesy. Vi moved through the corridors. It paused at things, doors, junctions, a photograph pinned to the wall outside the medical bay, Nurse Patterson's daughter at a birthday party, frosting on her nose. Not examining with instruments. Looking. Attending. It stopped for a long time in front of the garden deck. The garden deck was a long room with grow lights and soil from 6 continents and plants that had no practical purpose. They contributed nothing to the ship's oxygen supply that the mechanical systems didn't already handle. They were there because Dr. Yumi Tanaka, the ship's botanist, had argued successfully that a crew spending months in deep space needed to see things grow. The deck had herbs and small flowers and one determined tomato plant and a corner dedicated to a fig sapling that was technically in violation of 3 storage regulations and that everyone pretended not to notice. Vi stood in the doorway of the garden deck for 11 minutes. Sera stood beside it, saying nothing. Finally, she typed on the forearm interface, "What do you see?" Vi's response came slowly. It was building the expression from the shared vocabulary, careful about precision. When it came, Elise translated it as, "carried soil." The act of carrying soil between stars. "What does that mean?" Darius asked quietly. He was standing a few paces behind, permitted to be there but keeping his distance. "It means they find it significant," Elise said from his shoulder. "Not strange. Significant. They understand it as a statement, that we brought our ground with us. We should not leave our origin behind." She paused. "I think that's meaningful to them in a way we don't fully understand yet." Vi produced a color sequence, slow, layered, and the most complex thing it had communicated directly since boarding. Elise took several minutes to work through it. When she looked up, her expression had changed. Vi says, "The ones who came before carried no soil. The dormant thousands woke over 3 days. Not all at once, a gradual, tide-like emergence that Marco tracked through the sensors, now running at full capacity again, showing the structure's internal activity increasing in steady increments. The electromagnetic readings multiplied. The environmental gradient around the structure shifted again, not narrowing but expanding as though the structure itself was breathing deeper." Vi had returned to the structure after the visit to the Vailindra. There had been 3 days of what felt like internal deliberation. The color exchanges between Vi and the other 2 waking Vail had become rapid, dense, and layered in ways that exceeded Elise's current vocabulary. She could read intent but not content. She could see that a decision was being made. She could not see what the decision was until it was made. The decision was this: the Kareth, which was the name they had and which Elise transliterated as best she could, would wake. Kareth was not simply the people. The closest Elise could render it in English was something like the carried memory of a living people. It contained not just present individuals but the weight of accumulated experience across generations. When the Veil said Kareth, they meant something closer to what a human might mean by saying, everything we have ever been and are still. They were awakening to everything they had ever been and were still. The 3 days of emergence were extraordinary and strange. The Vailindra sat at the edge of the chamber and watched the structure come alive in ways that weren't visible to the eye but were visible to James's biological instruments and Marco's atmospheric sensors. The internal temperature of the structure's environment fluctuated. Electromagnetic signals multiplied, not in the 43-second UV rhythm, but in thousands of simultaneous individual patterns, overlapping and responding and building into something that Marco described as, like standing next to a conversation that is also a city. On the second day, Vi returned to the chamber and communicated something that Elise spent 2 hours working through before she brought it to Sera. "The dormancy," Elise said. "I understand it better now." She sat down heavily in the chair across from Sera's desk. "It wasn't a defensive shutdown the way I initially understood it. It was more deliberate than that. More chosen." "Chosen?" "The Kareth have I'm going to call it a philosophy, but it's deeper than that. It's more like a practice, around what happens when they encounter something they can't resolve. Something that doesn't fit their understanding of what the universe contains." She paused. "When the previous contact arrived, the one that discharged something at them, the Kareth made a collective decision. The concept Vi expressed is closest to withdrawing consent at that time. They decided to stop being present in that moment until it had passed and something different arrived." Sera looked at her. "They chose to sleep through it." "Through it, yes. But more than that, they chose not to allow that moment to be the moment that defined their next step. They refused to respond to aggression with aggression. They refused to be changed by violence into something that responds to violence." Elise's voice had taken on an odd quality. "They waited. For as long as it took. Until something arrived that was worth waking for." The silence in the room had weight. "How long?" Sera asked. "Vi communicated a time concept that I've been trying to convert to Earth years," Elise said. "Based on the stellar reference points involved, my best estimate is," she paused, "about 600 years." Sera said nothing. "They slept for 600 years," Elise said. rather than become something they would rather not be. Sera pressed her thumb against the inside of her wrist. Held it there. Released. And then we arrived, she said. And then you sat on the floor, Elise said, and told them you'd brought weapons and thought it was a mistake. And Vi went back to the Kareth and said, these ones carried soil. Sera looked at the ceiling of her quarters, plain alloy, functional, slightly scratched. She thought about the 47 civilizations she had studied in her career preparing for this mission. She thought about the Threshold Protocol and its 420 pages. She thought about the Committee of 17 who had chosen her because the situation had no precedent. They waited 600 years for us to be what we were yesterday, she said. Yes, Elise said. Caro, Sera said, quietly to herself, to the word that meant wait, that meant hold, that meant I see you. She had picked it up from the crew, heard Felix use it in a tense moment, and heard others adopt it. It had moved through the Vailindra like a small, unofficial vocabulary of patience. She stood up. I need to send a message to Earth, she said. The message took 4 hours to compose. Sera wrote it herself. Not unusual, she always drafted her own reports, but this one was different. This one she rewrote 11 times. This time she paced the length of her quarters repeatedly, tapping her left wrist and staring at the plain alloy walls. The Threshold Protocol required standardized reporting formats. Fields to fill. Data points to include. She filled them all. And then she added something that was not in the format. She wrote, we arrived with weapons and were received with patience that spanned 6 centuries. The Kareth, the civilization we have encountered, made the deliberate choice to become invisible rather than to become violent when previously met with violence. They waited 600 years in dormancy for contact that was worth meeting with wakefulness. I am asking the committee to reconsider the Titan-class deployment for subsequent contact missions. Not because the Kareth responded to our weapons with fear, they responded without fear. They responded to our weapons with awareness, and then they chose to evaluate us on different evidence. We passed that evaluation by accident. We succeeded because this team transported soil from 6 continents, and because I personally sat on the floor and acknowledged our error. I don't want to rely on accident again. The Kareth have a term in their communication system for voluntary transparency, which they consider a form of respect. They had never encountered it from outside their civilization before us. I want to suggest that this word, this concept, become the new organizing principle for Earth's first contact philosophy. The absence of weapons does not signal seriousness. Voluntary transparency as a signal of readiness. I am aware this recommendation exceeds my operational authority. I include this recommendation because, like the weapons issue with the Kareth, honest transparency is more important than appearances within our civilization. We are safe. We are well. We are in the presence of something that has been waiting for us longer than our entire recorded history of space exploration. Please give this message the same level of attention it deserves. Commander Sera Okafor UEF Vailindra Tessavar System. She read it over one more time. Then she sent it. She did not know how the committee would respond. She had a reasonable estimate based on 14 years of experience with how committees work, and the estimate was cautious. With meetings, some people see the term voluntary transparency and immediately start calculating its cost. She sent the message anyway. Felix confirmed transmission at 0340 ship time, looked at the content stamp and looked at her. Strong message, he said. Caro, she said. We wait. He smiled at that, a real one, not the professional kind. Yes, Commander. On the 12th day inside the structure, Elise came to Sera at a run. This was notable because Elise Vance did not run. She walked with intention. She stood with intention. She sat with the kind of stillness that suggested all her motion was inward. Seeing her on a run made every person she passed stop and turn. She found Sera on the garden deck, which had become Sera's thinking place aboard the ship. She was standing by the fig sapling looking at it but not seeing it. Vi communicated something this morning, Elise said, slightly out of breath. Something I've been trying to verify before I brought it to you. I verified it. Sera turned. Tell me. The Kareth have a second communication system, Elise said. Not the color patterns. Something different. Something they've apparently never used with an outside species because no outside species has been inside the structure long enough, or, I think, appropriate enough. She collected herself. Vi showed me something this morning. Not the color language. Something, it was more like being in a sound except not a sound, more like a resonance. A vibration that carries meaning. Sera went still. Not electromagnetic, Elise continued. Not light-based. It's My best understanding is that it's a direct exchange of pattern. Like two systems syncing. Like, she searched for words and found an analogy. Like two tuning forks in proximity. When one vibrates, it causes the other to vibrate in kind. The Kareth can initiate that. With each other. It's their deeper language. The color patterns are their public language. This scene is something else. And Vi showed you this because Vi wanted to show me something they couldn't express in color patterns, Elise said. Something that requires the deeper channel. She paused. Vi wanted to show me the dormancy from the inside. Sera looked at her. From the inside. What it was like. 600 years of, not sleep. Not nothing. Something else. Elise's expression was extraordinary. It was the face of someone who had been given something they had no category for and was trying to hold it with existing hands. I can't describe it the way I can describe something I've observed. I can only describe what I received. She paused. It wasn't absence. It was a different relationship with time. Like, time continued but they weren't in it the way we are in it. They were alongside it. And there was no suffering. That's what Vi needed me to know. There was no suffering. They didn't experience 600 years of waiting. They chose a posture that was outside the experience of waiting. Why did Vi need you to know that? Sera asked. Vi knew that you would carry the weight of the fact that I told you they'd been dormant for 600 years. And Vi wanted you to not carry it as guilt. Elise met her eyes. The Kareth didn't sacrifice themselves waiting for us. They chose something that was right for them, and then something worth choosing differently arrived. She paused. Vi said, and I want to get this as precise as I can, do not carry our dormancy as a debt. We do not provide it as a single unit. Sera was quiet for a long moment. They understand us very well, she said finally. Yes, Elise said. Better than we understand ourselves in some respects. What do they want from us? Sera asked. Not suspicious, genuinely curious. Elise thought. I've been trying to get to that. The concepts Vi has used most consistently, across all our exchanges, cluster around the exchange of internal experience. Not technology. Not resources. Not alliance in the political sense. She paused. They want to know what it's like to be us. What it feels like. What we find beautiful and what we find difficult and what we do when we can't resolve something. They've been watching the cosmos for a very long time. What they've been waiting for is not a civilization with a compatible technological level or political structure. They've been waiting for a civilization with a willingness to be known. The fig sapling in the corner put out a small new leaf, pale green, slightly translucent and curling at the edge. Sera looked at it. Then we should let them know us, she said. On the 15th day the message from Earth arrived. Sera was in the chamber with Vi when Felix patched it through to her earpiece. A protocol they'd established for communications that required her attention without removing her from the diplomatic space. She read it on a small secondary screen at her wrist. The committee had responded in 12 days, faster than she'd expected. She allowed herself a moment of cautious hope. The hope lasted approximately 3 sentences in the message. The committee acknowledged her report. They acknowledged the significance of the contact. They expressed, in the measured language of institutional bodies, something that functioned as excitement. And then they said they were sending a second ship. Not a diplomatic vessel. A survey vessel, specifically tasked with scientific and technological assessment of the Kareth structure and civilization. The language around its mission parameters used phrases like resource and knowledge exchange potential, and strategic asset evaluation. Sera read the description twice. She looked at Vi. Vi's colors were amber and slow, relaxed, attentive, in the middle of a long exchange about the concept of individual versus collective identity that had been running across 4 days of conversation. Vi looked back. Sera thought about choosing 600 years of sleep over violence. She thought about soil from 6 continents. She thought about the Committee of 17 and the 420-page protocol. She thought about the word that meant voluntary transparency as a form of respect. She typed on the interface, I have received a message from those above me. I need to tell you something about it. Vi produced the acknowledgement color, I am attending. They are sending another ship, Sera typed. Its purpose is to evaluate what you have and what it might mean for us. They do not yet understand what we have found here. A long pause. Vi's color changed, not alarming, not dark. But different. A quality she hadn't seen before. Do you tell us this because you believe it will cause harm? Vi asked. I tell you this because I told you about the weapons, Sera replied. The same reason. Vi was still for a very long time, longer than any pause Sera had observed from the Kareth. When the response came, it was slow and layered, and Elise took 10 minutes to work through it. Vi says, Elise reported, voice careful, we have considered this. We ask one question. When the second ship arrives, will you still be here? Sera looked at her mission parameters. Her orders were to maintain contact until relieved. She had no authority to refuse the survey ship. She had authority to be present when it arrived. She typed, yes, I will still be here. Vi's colors shifted, amber and gold and a deep violet, all moving together in a pattern that Elise had identified early in their exchanges as resolution. Then we will receive them as we received you, Vi communicated. Because you are here. Because you have shown us what your civilization can become. Sera sat with that. The enormity of it. The trust it represented, not naive trust, not the trust of beings who didn't understand the risk. The trust of beings who had 600 years of evidence about what contact could mean and who were choosing, with full knowledge, to remain open. Because she was there. She sent a second message to Earth that night. Not a formal report. Direct communication was sent to the committee chair, which significantly exceeded protocol. It said, the Kareth are prepared to receive the survey vessel on the condition that I remain present and that I am given authority to advocate on their behalf in any assessment process. If this is refused, I strongly recommend the survey vessel refrain from proceeding. I am not threatening noncompliance. I am telling you what I believe will happen to 600 years of patience if we walk in wrong this second time. Make sure I carry only debts I created. She sent it. She waited. In 12 days the committee responded. They agreed. 3 months after the Vailindra entered the Tessevar system, Sera stood on the garden deck alone at 0200 and looked at the fig sapling. It had grown. Not dramatically. Figs were slow. But there were 6 new leaves now, and the main stem was firmer, less tentative in its upward direction. Yumi Tanaka had been quietly triumphant about it for weeks. Technically in violation of 3 storage regulations. Still no one said anything. Sera thought about growth that didn't announce itself. The survey vessel, EF Meridian, a smaller ship, faster and crewed by 30 scientists and a diplomatic liaison named Dr. Karl Hesse, who had read her messages 4 times according to the committee correspondence and had sent her a personal note that said simply, I understand what you're protecting. I won't compromise it. Had arrived 5 weeks ago. She had been there when it docked, when its crew emerged, blinking into the light of the chamber. She had made introductions with the same quality of stillness she tried to carry through every moment of this mission. The Meridian's crew had been professional. Better than professional, they had been curious in the right way, which was the way that asked questions instead of assuming answers. Dr. Hesse had sat on the chamber floor on his second day and produced a small notebook and asked Vi, through the interface, whether it would consent to being the subject of a study. Vi had produced the gold wave applause. The knowledge exchange that followed had been, by any measure anyone could apply, extraordinary. This is not in the direction of resources and strategic assets. In the direction of understanding. The Karetha's relationship with time, the philosophy behind the dormancy, the practice of stepping outside a moment rather than being shaped by it, had produced, in Dr. Hesse's team, a shift in thinking that was already visible in how they moved through the structure, how they asked their questions, and how they held uncertainty. And the Kareth, for their part, were learning what it was to be curious in a human way, aggressive and restless and urgent in the questions, impatient with ambiguity, and prone to running 3 steps ahead and tripping. Vi had demonstrated something Elise interpreted as affection for this quality, not respect exactly, not admiration but warmth. The amber gold warmth of a being who finds something genuinely endearing about the things it does not share. The second language, the resonance exchange, the deeper channel, had been extended gradually to Elise and then to James. Not to everyone. To the ones who, in Vi's assessment, had the quality of attending. It was the greatest gift, in Kareth terms, that could be offered to another being, the invitation to share internal experience directly. James had come out of his first resonance exchange and sat quietly in the Vailindra's corridor for 2 hours. When Sera found him, she sat down next to him. Are you all right? She asked. I'm trying to hold something, he said. He looked at her with silver locks and 61 years of wanting this and finally having it. They showed me what they find beautiful, he said. The Kareth. What they find beautiful in the universe. What do they find beautiful? Persistence, he said. Not the grand kind. Not monuments. The small kind, the kind that keeps going without an audience. He was quiet for a moment. Figs, he said. They'd studied us enough to know about figs. Vi knew about the fig on the garden deck. Vi was pleased about the figure. Sera smiled, A real one, not the commander kind. Of course Vi was. Now, at 0200 on the garden deck, Sera looked at the fig sapling and thought about the message she would write in the morning. Not to the committee. To the archive, the long-form mission log that would be read by historians and diplomats and probably by schoolchildren someday, if this went the way she hoped it would go. She had been thinking about what to put at the center of it. Not the weapons. Not the sensors going blind. Not the 600 years of dormancy or the extraordinary second language or the survey vessel's arrival. These were all real, significant, and part of the record. What she wanted to put at the center was smaller. More precise. She wanted to write about the moment on the second day when Elise and Vi built the concept, consider before answering, together, from scratch, using 40 available colors and an afternoon of patient exchange, because neither of them had a word for it in the other's language, but both of them recognized that it was a concept worth having a word for. She wanted to write about Felix saying, HFY, when he first saw the veil, that involuntary human response to irreversible arrival, to the moment that cannot be unarrived at. The phrase had traveled the ship. It's in the unofficial vocabulary now, alongside Caro. Two phrases emerged from nowhere and settled into the daily speech of 212 people because they were precise. Caro. Wait. Hold. I see you. HFY. This is something that changes everything. We are here now. There is no going back. She wanted to write, first contact is not the moment you find the other. It is the moment the other finds you worthy of being found. She ran her thumb along the inside of her left wrist. With its 6 new leaves, the fig sapling caught her attention. She thought about a civilization that had chosen sleep over violence, 600 years of it, and then woken to see a giant ship with weapons aboard and one commander who sat down on the floor and said, I brought those weapons and I think that was a mistake. She thought about what it meant that they had called that transparency. She thought about how much of what passed for strength in the history of her civilization was really just the refusal to be seen. The veil had waited 600 years for something small. Not power. Not numbers. Not technology. Something small and consistent and almost impossible to fake. A willingness to be known. In the end, this is what the Veilindra's mission log recorded. The sensors became unresponsive when we entered. We thought this was a malfunction. It was not. It was an invitation to see without instruments. To use what we had brought with us that no instrument contained. We had brought dirt from 6 continents. We had brought a fig tree that violated 3 regulations. We had brought 47 disciplines and 212 people who, at the critical moment, managed not to panic. We had brought the habit of sitting on floors when the situation called for it. We had brought the practice of telling the truth to strangers at our own expense. We had brought, and I cannot fully account for this, only record it, the particular quality of attention of a species that is very young and very frightened and very determined to do better than it has done before. The Kareth called this quality by a word I will not attempt to spell phonetically, because its exact pronunciation is outside the range of human vocal anatomy. But Elise Vance translated it as the practice of making oneself small before the truth. They had a word for it. Which means they had been waiting for it. We arrived. We were received. We were, in ways we are still learning, changed. This is the beginning. And